Greetings, Unhidden Voices family, and welcome to episode 18. This episode is an interview that I conducted with a friend of mine and colleague from Sacramento State University. His name is Dale Allender. Dale and I have known each other for about 10 years. He was a professor of mine at UC Berkeley when I was a graduate student, and he actually recruited me to Sac State. We are the only two Black professors in the teaching credentials department. He's the only Black male, I'm the only Black female. Last spring, we made a pact to really save each other's lives and to make a commitment to support each other when it came to being against face-to-face instruction. When we learned that the coronavirus, COVID-19, was disproportionately impacting Black people and to the detriment of our lives. So Dale and I also talk about Afrofuturism as an antidote to anti-Blackness, and including what's happening with the global pandemic, where Black people are being, murdered and harmed. And then also when we think about COVID-19. And so just the possibility for a liberatory future. It's a very beautiful and powerful episode. So please listen to that. We are preparing ourselves for voting, and so it's really important that everyone is aware of not only the importance of voting, but how to actually vote and how to make a plan and how to support other people in our communities who have been disproportionately impacted and disenfranchised from our votes. Particularly, this impacts folks who are felons who have felony convictions are not allowed to vote. So we need people on the in our state legislatures and in our government, our federal government, that will help to change and enfranchise folks that have been disenfranchised. We need to change that the laws that take away the vote from, Black and brown people specifically, because we need to recognize that our vote has been legislated against us, particularly for Black people in this country since our enslavement in this country. If we think about the Voting Rights Act, was of 1965. A lot of people were harmed in producing that, and then since then we still have, whole segments of our community that are unable to vote. I also want to just say that it's not just voting for president, although that is important. We need to be focusing on the measures that impact the propositions that impact your community. You need to be aware of them. You need to seek out resources to help. Like I talked to my mom, and we went through measure by measure and specifically looked at, and I said, if you vote yes, Mom, this is what it means. If you vote no, this is what it means. And then I went and picked her up and took her to downtown Oakland so she could actually drop her ballot off. That's what we need to be doing. And that can't just be like, oh, everybody vote. No, we need to be doing the things to support each other to get that done. We need to make a plan. We also have to be recognize that this voting by mail and even voting in person is a hardship for whole swaths of people. In San Francisco, and this needs to change, you can only vote between 8 and 5 p.m. We went there, and I thought they would have a place to drop off our ballots. They do not. And I actually sprained my ankle, so I'm not able to stand in a line or even drive downtown. So these are the things, and if you think about folks who are, wheelchair bound, folks that are elderly, folks that are, have, afraid of getting COVID-19. I mean, these are the realities that, we're asking people to overcome. And we need to make sure that Election Day is a federal holiday so that you get paid to vote, and that you don't actually lose your job for going down and voting on Election Day. So these are things that we can do, and they're simple, but they're important. All right, that's my plug for voting. That's my plug for this episode. If you like this episode, please subscribe and continue to listen, learn, and amplify with us.
Okay. We're being recorded, right? Still, right?
Yeah, so I turned it off. I just turned it back on because, so I wanted to I feel like, we should record this because this is going to be pretty dynamic and we should just, get it going. So one of the things that really made me want to, well, there's several reasons why I wanted to follow up with you and in our conversation. And I know that you have participated in a few panel conversations that we've done. And, we had that special 2-part series of Unhidden Voices, and you were on that panel. For those of you who are listening or watching this podcast, Dale and our relationship actually goes back to grad school. I was a student in your class, and so, and it really was that I credit that class that it was a class that you were co-teaching with Professor Jabari Mahiri at UC Berkeley on digital youth. Right. And that was over a decade ago, right?
It was a pivotal class. It was a pivotal class.
It was phenomenal. And that was when I actually joined Facebook and Twitter because of that class. And so
I can see that. I can see that.
It was like I was doing it for homework, and then I actually got, a lot of my family, and I was like, log on to Facebook, and and so now I feel guilty because like Facebook is.
Well, we didn't know, right? We didn't have that level of criticality necessarily then, because these were emerging technologies.
They were absolutely were. And so that was part of our relationship, has been sort of navigating these spaces. And you are one of the people who I really look to. We've done, we co-teach a course at Sac State, and we've co-facilitated a few dialogues for our students about media literacy. And folks may not be aware of this, but you and I actually had I think it was a very healing conversation, and this was at the beginning of the pandemic. And at that point, we were discussing, and we named the fact that we saw this as a genocidal attack on Black people. And we also made a very concerted effort to say that we would in no way agree to any face-to-face instruction as Black faculty, because we recognize that our lives, we're in the point of like where we would be putting our lives at risk by teaching face to face, right? And so we made that pact with each other. And as a result of that pact and the continued conversation and the work, we've just really been, over the summer and, this fall, just really trying to plan and put all these things together. And so we did the convocation on September 29th, I believe, on Tuesday. And in that conversation, you named that this neo-genocide is a practice that's happening. So I thought it really important to have you on, to have you speak to this concept of neo-genocide. What does that actually mean, for the Black community? The disinformation, we just hear that Trump, the president of the United States, has been the leader of disinformation about the coronavirus.
Yes, that is right.
And so I think it's
Columbia,
really
right, that did that research. Yes.
And so, and I know that a lot of your work has been about, focusing on disinformation in the media. And so I'd like you to just clear. So there's a lot.
Yeah. And there usually are so many points of intersection and connection and infusion when we talk, because, I know your work, right? Yes, that class, but also the work you did on Black language, right, in the other course in Berkeley, but also your broadcast media work before coming up into Berkeley, before coming up into that master's and PhD program, and then also your curricular work now, and not just the curriculum writing you're doing, but also doing this transmedia thing, like This podcast is one instance of that, but that's just sort of your latest iteration of doing transmedia work.
Wow.
You know, it's scholar activist, it's Afrofuturist. And so I have all that love and adoration that way. So I'm happy to be a colleague. And I really appreciate that this is a platform for talking about this particular topic. It's very, very important. You know, it's cliche in a way, or I guess the new word for cliche is it's mean. I don't know. Right? In the sense that, you know, this meme has gone around. If you ever wondered what you were doing during the Holocaust, look around. You're doing it now. You know, and there's a lot of truth to that. There's a lot of truth to that, and I think in that meme actually is some of the origins of my own thinking about this.
Yeah.
You know, as an undergrad in Milwaukee, there was a Black Holocaust museum. And it wasn't, you know, it, as I understand, I believe it exists to this day and is now in a formal structure.
Yeah.
But really, at the time, it was this one gentleman, I don't remember his name. I think he was a local scholar activist in Milwaukee. But he would just show up to various events, fairs, places, and he would display documents and books and images and figures. And that evolved for him over time. So that always stayed in my head. Because I remember one time referencing it to somebody else out of state. And they were like, "You got a Black Holocaust museum? What?" You know? And it's like the concept, right?
Yes.
But then more recently, the idea of genocide first came into my mind in relation to these kids in cages.
Yes.
Because that's so blatant and so current and contemporary.
Right.
But what's fascinating is the concept keeps evolving in terms of my personal experience and the thinking out there. Because then, not long after that, in my work with the Southern Poverty Law Center, we started doing some work with the Equal Justice Initiative. I was on the Teaching Tolerance Board, so we went down the summer before and the summer of the opening of his Stevenson's Peace Museum and Lynching Memorial.
Yes.
And so first, just being in those spaces, the visceral.
I think we need to, because I think there's like four things, named in like that just opening that we have to stop, and you know, for folks that may not be familiar. So
for sure, right?
So let's name. Okay, so first you said transmedia. So I'm just gonna go you know, I'm taking mental notes. So okay, so let's explain transmedia. What is transmedia? Because you said you mentioned the word transmedia.
So you know, transmedia is carrying a concept, a proclamation, an idea across different forms of media.
Yeah.
And in each instance, I mean, it's folklore, really. Okay, this is a folkloric thing, right? But it's electronic folklore. The process of it. It's carrying it across different mediums of expression, and in each instance, both the hardware, the software, the relationships, the context, nuances and changes that message, that concept, so such that if you engage something in, you know, from a transmedia frame, you're seeing, you know, layers of understanding, layers of expression. Sometimes they're in contention, sometimes they're not, right? It's like, you think of Dead Prez, critical hip hop group, Deb Prez, for listeners, right? Underground critical hip hop, you know, revolutionary hip hop group, right? But then in their video, where they're most revolutionary from an organized international standpoint, right? Where like they're not just espousing particular things, but they're even including video segments of talking about being down with Hugo Chavez and the like, right? But the video for one of the songs has M1 in like a Ferrari, such and like, just driving this thing, right? And so those can be, you know, contradictory, right? But the same person conveying the same revolutionary messages in these different mediums and so forth, right? If you got the CD, because it was CDs then you knew that, well, you might not have known, because I didn't know. First, that you'd get audio, and then you'd also have a little ending video component if you flipped it over. But like, you had to know to do that, because CDs weren't flipped back and forth like 45s or 33s, right? Wow. And so like all of this conceptual design stuff is going into this transmedia work, right? So you'd have to know to flip it. And you'd have to have DVD capabilities as well as CD capabilities, all of which could be in somebody's home. It's not that, you know, far flung and high tech, but still not immediately available. And then once you knew to flip it, you know that you'd get this little video of M1, rice and beans, talking about Joanne Chesimore and Hugo Chavez.
You know, it's so interesting, because one of the things that I have noticed is the move from, like, you know, we're doing this podcast and we have been doing these for 3 months. Like, we started in June. We launched Unhidden Voices in June. And at that point, when most folks were at home, you know, we also had it as YouTube. So the YouTube channel was really, you know, the site of, like, everyone would, you know, watch the shows and the episodes on YouTube. And now that a lot of folks have gone back to work, they're, you know, they're no longer able to be at home. The space where most people are engaging with the podcast is through the audio, you know, and I did both. Like, I did both. So when you're talking about the transmediation of it, it's like, you can watch it as a you know, a video on YouTube. You can listen to it through the audio. It's the same, but it's a different, even entire process, listening to it or watching it, right? And the way in which you engage with it, the different contexts for which you're able to do that. You know, if you're driving in your car, listening, like I actually listen every time I do the episode. I listen on Monday with everyone else. I watch on Monday, and then and when it's aired, and what I typically do is I'll you know, post it on we host it on Anchor, so I'll post it there, and then I will log in and I'm doing I'll walk, you know, and I'll listen to the podcast, you know, and it's like for me, I'm listening to it almost like I'm not a part of it. You know, it's a very,
sure.
You know, it's all, because there's also things that I will, you know, when you're engaging in a conversation, you're not necessarily picking up on things. Right. When you talk a lot about brain science, which, you know, I think is also a very important aspect of what we're, even the transmediation piece, right?
Absolutely.
The way in which certain aspects of our brain, you know, we're triggering, targeting. And so then in addition to that, we have, like, you know, this written blog that we do. So there's also, like, trying to mediate these conversations through the written work. And so part of what I have been doing is using the podcast in the classes and having the students actually respond. And so there's this course that I've been teaching at which I'm really excited about. I was teaching a Saturday class at USF, and in the past I've taught this class, and I've written about it, which is like African American educational thought. But they asked me to teach for the first time a class of human rights in the media.
Oh.
And so, and it is, oh my, like this class is everything. It's so, you know, shout out to my students, you know, it's my Saturday class. So yeah, so but one of the things that we do is, you know, like Joy Reid has this the segment of her show, which is Who Won the Week, right? And she would have people that were her guests basically make arguments in terms of the media representations that they felt, you know, won the week, right? And so I do that with the students, and I'll say, you know, in addition to like consuming the media that I give you, you also have to consume any media that you choose, and then basically write a piece about it that kind of says like, you know, a blog about it, right? Like, this is why I wrote this. This is how it connects to human rights. This is why I think. And then when we have a class, they actually argue, like, and say, like, you know, this is not argue, but basically put forth, like, this is the media and this is why I think, you know, it won. And they also do that in the discussion board, right, where they comment on. So one of the students who's also a mentee of mine wrote this phenomenal piece about the white woman who's a professor in, she basically did blackface where she pretended she was Afro-Latina. And I forget the university that she was like, you know what I'm talking about? It's something.
I think she was at Rutgers, wasn't she?
Yeah, that's a Rutgers University. Right.
Yes.
So what they
hold on. Pause.
Okay.
How is this woman going to try to be Puerto Rican in Rutgers and be down the street from the borough where she says she's from and not think she might come into contact with somebody from that very borough? Okay.
But the thing is, it's the audacity, right? And so part of it, but part of what I really appreciated also about my students, Alminera is her name, and Alminera,
that's a beautiful name.
Sorry, their name. So Alminera writes about this idea of how anti-Blackness also looks like in terms of the erasure of even more sort of dark skin. So taking on, like, white people taking on this sort of light skin aesthetic of like pleasure, right? So you could say that I'm Puerto Rican and I have this and I can put on, like, you know, the big earrings or what have you, and then aesthetically be still considered exotic, beautiful, what have you. But of course, you're not going to do that, and it's impossible for them to do that for darker skinned Black people. And it also to the concept of Black is, you know, Blackness is exoticized and beautiful if it's light. Right. But the aesthetic of a darker skin. So then this is further. So she's arguing, or they're arguing, that this further erases the experiences of Black people, depending on your, you know, your skin complexion as a Black person. And so it was a very powerful piece. So I said, I'm going to institute a guest authorship, like you know, where the students have an opportunity, if they win the week, to actually, if they want to share their piece on the blog. So, so I'm going to be releasing Alminera's piece on Unhidden Voices. And so, so folks will have opportunity to read it. So I know this is a long.
Well, all of this is, you know, linked right up to your human rights education in the media. All of this is linked up to concepts of genocide, which is linked back into human rights education in the media, you know, and disinformation is a piece of that. I mean,
that's right.
There's so many places that, did you hear this morning the most blatant weaponizing of information, of disinformation this morning. You know, CNN reported, they covered the doctor's press conference.
Mm-hmm.
And then moments after the press conference ended, and I don't know if you saw the press conference, it's okay if you didn't, right? But, you know, essentially, hey, we're good. Everything's good here. Everything's good here. Everything's good here. We're not going to answer your questions. We're not going to give you those details, but everything's good here. Everything's good here, right? Moments after the press conference ended, CNN reports, you know, they're reporting on the press conference, they're reporting on the cognitive dissonance just in some of the information that was put out in that press conference. And then they report that an unnamed source in the white coats, like the doctors had, handed the press pool a note, anonymous, that said, the president was taken to the hospital because of concern over his vitals. There's no clear path toward recovery at this time. So both of these messages are coming, right? Like gets into imposter context in some regards, right? Because like, well, what is that?
Yes.
You know, so anyway,
this has been this moment for me personally, just navigating. So I was alive when Ronald Reagan was shot. I remember I was in middle school when Ronald Reagan was shot. And our middle school teacher actually asked us to write letters, but I had such a negative concept of Ronald Reagan that I wrote the nastiest letter you can imagine.
They wanted you to write letters to Ronald Reagan. Oh my God.
In Berkeley, if you can think about it.
This is in Berkeley.
This is in Berkeley. And my middle school teacher was so racist. Mr. Felker, if you're still alive, you were racist. Okay. So Mr. Felker, like they, I believe it was Mr. Felker, that had us write this letter. And I just wrote basically like, oh, I hope you die. You know, like I just really had such a bad, I can't even remember. It was like, you know, but that, so then Twitter comes out and says, don't be saying, right? And so my mom, so okay. So fast Thursday night, and I'm watching Don Lemon, and he's saying, okay, you know, the president's saying that he's waiting the test results, and he went on Sean Hannity, and he's saying he's waiting it, and so we're gonna hear back soon, and you know. And I said, the president's positive. This is what I'm thinking. I'm like, there's no way, because this president would never kind of go on Sean Hannity and be like, oh, I'm waiting test results. Because he's the person who says he gets a test every day. Now, what I thought to myself was, he is positive, and more than likely he infected his aide instead of the other way around. But he did not, he was still thinking that he was going to be asymptomatic. Right. And so then that way, as asymptomatic and a very selfish person, that's why he still went to the fundraiser and whatnot. Okay. So this is all in my head. And then that, like literally as I'm processing this, then Trump says, tweets, you know, me and the first lady are positive, right? I said, okay, they're positive. I knew it, right? Next thing you know, dude is going to the hospital.
Yep.
And I said, so that means he's been positive for days.
Yep.
He's been positive for days.
Yep.
Because you can't go from, oh, I just got this positive test. I'm fine. I'm not even having a fever. I'm so good. To the hospitalization for, you know. piece. And the experimental drugs. Like, who gives experimental drugs to somebody with mild symptoms? I was like, I called my doctor when I remember, because I was sick and I couldn't get a test. I was sick in February. I was sick for the whole month of March. I was sick for 6 or 7 weeks and I could not get a test. I could not get a test, and they told me to treat myself as if I had the flu. They gave me prescriptions over the counter. They gave me so many prescriptions. They gave me prescriptions for antibiotic prescriptions, prescriptions for flu symptoms, prescriptions for allergies. They just was like, take anything, but just don't come to the hospital, right? And when and my doctor was like, just drink lots of fluids, treat yourself like you have a cold, right? And I was just like, you know how and I was turning on TV and getting to the disinformation piece. People were saying like, just spray your nose with, if you're, spray your nose with the with the blow dryer, and that's gonna kill the coronavirus because it lives in your nasal passages. And I was literally trying to find a blow dryer.
They were telling us to go out and stand in the sun.
Yes, and this is why Black people, because we getting to the neo-genocide, the misinformation, and the because Black people, we are a community that believes in conspiracies, right? And the reasons why we believe in them is because we have been victims of them. COINTELPRO, for example, right? Tuskegee, Tuskegee experiment, for example, right? These are things that have been documented, attempts to annihilate us, right? And so I knew, I said, this is the fact that he went from means that he's not just having mild symptoms, right?
That's right.
So every time I turn on the news, I'm just expecting to hear some devastating news about him. And I like my mom, and the thing is, my mother said, you don't want to laugh at someone if they're sick or what have you, because you don't want to be sick and you don't want anyone you love to be sick, and karma is a real thing, so you don't want to put that energy out. Right. So and I respect my mom.
I laughed when I heard Kellyanne Conway got it.
I was just like, Kelly, but you know what? But this is the thing. Like, when we think about karma, right? And like what you put in because when I think about the fact that my cousin and my aunt died, and this dude was like, it is what it is.
That's right.
That there's like 210,000 people that lost their lives to this, and he could care less, and he didn't pay any money. He paid $750, and he's getting the medevac helicopter, Marine One, to Walter Reed Hospital, getting the best care and experimental drugs and all these things off of our dime. And that's what happens when you're the president. Like, we make that investment, and we have no choice, right? In who gets
we do, right? But we don't, there's a social contract.
Right.
We do that for our president because we expect
the president.
Right.
Our president.
Right.
Yes, the president.
But there's an expectation and a belief, right? And now I'm gonna split hairs because you corrected me, right? There's an expectation and a belief that even if we know your policies are anti-Black and anti-racist, anti-Black and racist, we expect and believe that you've got the larger country's back, that you're not doing something to jeopardize the whole goddamn ship. Excuse my expression.
No, don't need.
You might put a road through a neighborhood, and you might really mess up some, communities over here. It is not that you want displacement, but like if we have a sense that the broader piece is intact, we'll migrate because we do that. We have done that.
I've done that, and we
Right?
will do that. That's
You
right.
know, we'll seek higher ground.
Yes.
You know, we'll
Yes,
do
that's
that.
right.
But we're in a situation where, and this is why Amina, this is why his every act becomes a neo-genocidal act.
Mm-hmm.
His every act.
So that's why that's the next. Okay, so neo-genocide is a term that you have to explain and define for us, and you also need to define Afrofuturism.
All right.
And those are the only three now because we've been talking, and I think I forgot the other two. But I feel like I remembered neo-genocide and I remembered Afrofuturism.
You know what? I love it that those two terms are put next to each other, because, and that's the poetry of this moment right now, okay? Because I didn't structure that, right? It's because I'm sitting here talking to you and you saw that lens onto it. Because Afrofuturism is the antidote to the neo-genocide.
Yes.
Afrofuturism and Afrofuturism is, first, it's a belief in Black futures.
That's right.
Right? It's a belief in Black futures. So in there is automatically the seed of the continuation of its humanity.
Yeah.
Right? It is Black people, but it's humanity, because we are humanity, right?
Yeah,
Now, I know that this brother who wrote this recent book that I sent you, that one podcast,
yes.
Is an anti-humanity philosopher, right? But I don't want to take us in that direction in the moment, but just to say, okay, if we want to localize it and not expand it, because he's an Afrofuturist too.
Right.
I would say that it is about the belief in Black futures, the future of Black people. And then it is an exploration of possible futures.
Yes.
Using creativity and innovation and all the things that we've always used. And so thereby it is also a connection to African past.
Right.
Right? On the mythological side and also on the philosophical side. And so those themes and those stories and those motifs, sometimes extremely explicit, hit you on their head explicit, come forward. And sometimes less so, but there are those echoes in there. And I would say that Itasha Womack is the Afrofuturist who I would read to get a little start of it. Philosophically, right? But if you just wanted to just like look at it, I would say type in George Clinton Parliament Funkadelics in YouTube. Right?
And the singer, the artist, an actor who was in the Antebellum.
Janelle Monáe.
Janelle Monáe's work, right?
And her prototype, right? Erykah Badu, really, right? These were Afrofuturist performers. You know?
And Lovecraft Country, right?
I haven't seen it yet, but I believe so.
Okay, so Lovecraft Country is based in 1950s, 1960s Chicago. It's very post-Korean War. Vietnam War, and they travel to Vietnam, so you see that connection. But they also talk about like this mythological and this witchcraft, and they're dealing. And this last episode was it's called I Am, and this woman time travels as a Black woman. Through different, right? It's pretty fun. It's and meets like these I don't even know if they're like human, extra human, beings who are Black women that give her the capacity to travel through time and to also speak in herself into existence. That episode 6, I believe, of Lovecraft Country.
I gotta watch it now. I gotta
Yeah,
watch it.
yeah. I mean, there's now after just caution. It is gory, and there's parts of it's like what, like some of the creatures, like when they get to another planet, I'm like, this is a little bit weird.
Mm-hmm.
But the concepts I think are good. And the other thing I think is really very powerful is the love relationship, the sort of nuances of the relationships, right? And the character development. And that's really some very strong characters in this in the show. So yeah,
I can't wait to see it.
Country is, and also Watchmen.
Watchmen definitely
Was
definitely.
Yeah. So, but these are also very gory.
They are, because Afrofuturist, I think, is it's not flinching, right? I mean, in order to deal with this future, like, we've got to come to terms with a lot of past stuff.
That's right.
We're not, right? And that takes us to the neo-genocide, right? That's why it's a neo-genocide, because they haven't come to terms with what Stevenson, who had the lynching memorial, called America in a post-genocide, right? He said we were in a post-genocidal moment, which is, again, where I'm seeing the continuity of or the relevance of the concept of genocide at all in our current moments, right? This is how he framed it, and he talked about it as we might think, right? The transatlantic slave trade and everything thereafter, and prior to and simultaneous settler colonialism, right? Removing the indigenous folk, and so he's laying that out, and I'm like, I can totally get with that, right? I can totally get with that.
So I think part of it, that was the other one, was you talk about and you locate this lynching memorial, but you have to explain what it is and where it is, because people, I think people may be unfamiliar with it, and I think we also need to acknowledge that we are currently in the moment where lynching has become a federal crime, but that just happened, I believe, as a result of Stevenson's work. And then, right, and that happened 2019, that it became a federal crime to lynch someone, so talk a little bit about more.
Yeah. So again, my work with the Southern Poverty Law Center, Teaching Tolerance, they had established this relationship with Stevenson, who is a death row attorney, who established a nonprofit in Montgomery, Alabama. Now, he established his offices in what he later learned were the warehouses and where the auctions were. And, it was very, very close to the Capitol buildings and the courthouse and all of this and so forth. And he began to look into this more deeply. And at some point, it connected him up with lynchings and understanding the lack of any legal recourse in many, many, many lynchings. And so at some point they established a project where they were researching and documenting every lynching that has happened in the country and focusing most exclusively for display on African Americans. We came over to, we as in the Teaching Tolerance Advisory Board, at the close of our meetings, our summer meetings a couple of years ago. We went over to just meet with them, hear about their work at that point, and understand that the Southern Poverty Law Center was engaging in partnerships with Equal Justice Initiative there. What was incredible was to see the room with the jars of dirt, because they have a wall where all of the lynchings that they had been able to research, and this was how they displayed it initially, all of the lynchings that they were able to research and locate and document, they would get a jar full of the dirt from that land, that location where this person had been lynched. And when I saw it, it was a warehouse wall full of big mason jars, big, clear, nicely cleaned mason jars. So you can see all of the earth and the variations of the earth, the gravel, the dust, representing Black people who had been lynched from all over the United States. And it was overwhelming. The next year, maybe it was 2 years after, but I believe it was the next year, they had opened up a peace memorial, and I forget the exact title of the museum, but it's essentially a history of slavery museum. And they do have some ways for you to do some genealogical work there as well, but mostly it's actually a very visual, overwhelming kind of experience. There's lots of documented information, but very visual, photographs, large size, worth going to by all means. But offsite is the transformation of those jars into a full-blown walking life-size, memorial. Each one of those jars are now represented by a large, hanging, rusting piece of iron, large, and then etched on there is the name, the date, and the location. Now, I mean, when I say walking, it's like maybe half a football field size, maybe more. And you enter into the space, at about level with these hanging iron slats. And they're about the size of your body. They're long. But as you walk further in, the ground, right, begins to go downward. And so the bars are rising, right? And then now names and stories are along the wall. I'm talking about so-and-so was lynched for scolding one of her white students because she cursed or something to that effect. So-and-so was lynched for going to a union meeting, right? Things of this nature. And so then you further go, now you're going down, you're turning, and it's almost like you're going inward. There's a fountain somewhere in the background, and ultimately you're led outside, and those same iron slats representing the folks who are hung are laying in rows, laying in rows, laying in rows. So it's a very large space. It's an amazing thing to have as a memorial when we're talking about, memorials, right, and statues and so forth. So, because it's not just tear down a statue, but it's also erect this piece. I want to tell you another piece of this for me, in terms of the genocide, is I referenced during our conversation with our deans the other day. Yeah. I was also a Holocaust educator and have been to Jerusalem. And there is at Yad Vashem, there's a Allies Walkway, so forth. I guess what I'm trying to get at is that when people speak of that hallowed ground of Yad Vashem and what is conjured by this understanding of these folks in this Holocaust, you begin to understand Stevenson saying, yes, this was a Holocaust, this was a genocide,
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
that we're representing for you one way in which folks were subjected to the genocide.
Right. Right.
Because what I think, and this is also part of the neo-genocide, and it links back to transmediation,
Mm-hmm.
that is that when we talk about the Holocaust or neo-genocide or a genocide,
Yeah.
we're not talking about just one act. And we know that, right? Because we're talking about killing many people.
Yeah.
But we're also not talking about just one category of action or behavior.
Right.
There's multiple things occurring, multiple means in which death is occurring. And again, that is why you take just two examples, okay? We can get away from the cages for a moment even.
Mm-hmm.
This man, 45, on the one hand, he's telling Californians, you got to clean up these logs.
Mm.
You got to clean up this debris.
Yes. Yes.
Then we
Forest management.
and we understand that 52% of that is federal land.
Yes. Yes.
And we understand you know that.
Right.
So you know that. That means you're complicit in letting those fires burn.
And see, and the thing is that makes me, and I want to also just name the fact that when you talk about the memorial to the victims of lynching, I believe that that's like 3,000 people that they were able to uncover.
Yeah.
And then when you name the memorial to, or the lack of the memorial to, the victims of the COVID-19, the Black victims, I just saw that there's been 40,000.
It's astounding, isn't it?
Right. It's 40,000 in a matter of 6 months.
Yes.
Right. 40,000 Black people have died.
Yes.
Now there's other
yes.
races, but if you think about the fact that just the disproportionate number, like if you think of out of 200,000 people, 40,000 of us, that's like, what's that, 20%, right? Or something.
Yes.
That's not normal.
No. And we knew this, which means he knew this.
Right.
He had all the information. That's been clear now. He knew this and willfully carried on.
That go back to schools.
We know who's in the schools.
Right. In the public school system, it's us, right? It's us.
Exactly. Targeted certain states with his militias, like Michigan.
Right.
To push us further to open up, like Miami, right? The Deep South.
And even in California. So and this is the connection to because if you remember that we actually had very low numbers in our state.
That's right.
And there was a very vocal, edged on by the president of the United States. And this was also at the moment when you and I had our conversation, because
that's right.
There was a vocal group out of Southern California, Orange County, very privileged. There was a mayor there who basically said something to the effect of, I don't know anyone who has died. Do you? Kind of, very like, if it's not my problem, then why should I wear a mask or socially distance or what have you? And those vocal people, even though this is a blue state, the governor succumbed to the pressure of
That's right.
People who are, large donors and very highly, affluent.
That's right.
Communities and zip codes.
Mm-hmm.
right?
Mm-hmm.
And to the detriment of the rest of us, right? And so even like one of the things is like I'm here in San Francisco, and when this first happened, and we were sheltering, and in February, our Mayor Breed announced that, okay, we're going to close down everything before, right?
Yeah, you could see it, you could hear it. Little
before,
signs of it
like,
like that.
like
Yeah.
we only have 1 or 2 cases. We're just going to be proactive, and I appreciated that.
Yep.
Right.
Yep.
We are currently red, and everything's opening up. And when we were at 2 or 3 cases and they shut us down, I contacted the mayor's office because I said, are we going to still have to succumb to like the street cleaning and all of these things? And they said no. Why do I have a ticket, right? I have a ticket, a street cleaning ticket, and we are still in a red category. You understand what I'm saying? So they've opened up despite the fact that it's against so we're still trying to preserve our health. And again, as Black people, we are the most at risk, for death as a result of this virus. So I don't interact. Like I very rarely drive my car. I might go to the grocery store, but if I'm doing anything, it's walking, and I have a ticket.
Yeah.
Right. And I'm like, this is absurd, right? Because we're still, you can't tell us on the one hand to, keep your distance, you do all these things, wear a mask when you're in public, blah, 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 and then to penalize people, for doing that. That is.
No. And there's so many ways in which that has occurred. There's so many ways. And there's ways in which that has been addressed in other countries where they give people a living wage so they're ensured that they'll stay inside, and then they relax on that other stuff. But you know what we should do? We should, for a moment, lay out some parameters on this definition of genocide.
Right.
The one reason that I mentioned the Holocaust piece is because I recall when I was there was an intense debate that the Jewish scholars and teachers were having amongst themselves that I observed. And that was a fascinating observation. That the Armenians have been talking about recognizing the Armenian genocide for a long time, right? And there are some Jewish scholars who hold the Jewish Holocaust above all other genocides,
including the Black genocide. Right? Yeah.
And so it was fascinating to listen to these cats debate this. And most of the folks fell on the side of, yes, the Armenian genocide was a genocide. Look at the definition of genocide. You can see these are all genocides. But they acknowledged that the institutions in which we were having this debate were not acknowledging these other genocides.
Exactly, which is one of the things that, like, institutionally, for our universities, our schools, and what have you, are not acknowledging this, right? And so this is one of the reasons why I think it's so important for us to name, to name that this is actually happening, and also to acknowledge like the impending sort of the terror that we experience as a result of the reality of that, this danger is real.
And you know what? Toward that end, again, right? If we look at the parameters of this definition, the very first one is obviously killing members of a group, right? And this is according to the United Nations Charter, which Ronald Reagan eventually signed off on, right? The United States did not, even though it helped establish these organizations, didn't sign off on them, and but eventually did, right? So, and this gets down to why we're not talking about in an official capacity and hearing people charge genocide, right? Because this is a legal term.
Right.
So you can be prosecuted for this. So killing members of a group, right? Harming members of a group, right? So, okay, you might not die from COVID, but you were harmed.
That's right. That's
You were
right.
harmed en masse, making it possible for people to live, right? To avoid harm, mental or physical, putting folk under duress.
Yes.
These are genocidal conditions. Taking the children away from the group. That's in the charter. That's the last bullet, right? These things are happening.
That's right.
And they've been happening. But why it's the neo is all of these things we're speaking of in this new transmediated age. Because even before Brian Stevenson was talking about a post-genocidal society, in 1951, William Patterson, Paul Robeson, and those cats went over to Paris to the United Nations.
Yeah.
After that charter had been put out. And based on Patterson's book, which has been recently re-released, we call genocide, or we charge genocide. And they laid out all of the conditions to the United Nations under which the US was enacting genocide against Black Americans at that time.
I think one of the things that I really appreciate, and I think that it'd be good to also speak, because you talked about the notion of taking the children away, and the children in cages obviously is a means of literally taking children away, because they're separating children from their families. But another way in which this is also happening is this notion of saying that our children are not at risk, right?
Yes. Yes.
And then putting our children into spaces which put them at risk, right? It's like, oh, children are not at risk, so let's risk them by putting them, reopen schools at this point, right? So this is also, and children, like I remember hearing, I'm gonna put this in the chat because I think this is a beautiful quote, and it's a two-parter, and I shared it yesterday with I'm doing these trainings for faculty at Colgate University, and on becoming anti-racist. And
I did hear that. I did see, I might have seen your flyer or something. I don't know, but or maybe you just told me before, but I had heard that you were doing it.
Okay, you know what? It won't let me copy and paste. All right, so I'll just have to read it. Because it says, this is Frantz Fanon, and this is 1952, Black Skin, White Mask, his book. Okay, so this is an excerpt. He says, I came into the world imbued with the will to find a meaning in things, my spirit filled with the desire to attain to the source of the world. And then I found that I was an object in the midst of other objects. Sealed into that crushing objecthood, I turned beseechingly to others. Their attention was a liberation, running over my body, suddenly abraded into non-being, endowing me once more with an agility that I had thought lost, and by taking me out to the world, restoring me to it. But just as I reached the other side, I stumbled, and the movements, the attitudes, the glances of the other fixed me there, in the sense in which a chemical solution is fixed by dye. I was indignant. I demanded an explanation. I burst apart. So it's like, right? And that indignation, I feel like this indignation is what we're expressing now, right? And this is what we're expressing now. This is like, they're trying this indignation at the neo-genocidal forces that are trying to subject us to this, right? This fixedness of like, we have no choice but to die, right? and this is what your destiny is. And so that terrorizing experience is the one that we can actually say, like, you know what, we reject this. We are fighting against this. You know, I was saying to my, my mom was here a couple of weeks ago, and I was talking about, she was listening to one of the podcast interviews that I did, this episode that I did with my cousin, Mateen. And I was asking about what keeps him motivated, like in this moment, what's inspiring his fight. And so I used the word fight. And she was like, I don't know if fight is the right word. And I was like, but it is, because what else do we have? Right. And so in my mind, that the indignation is what, right, that we need.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. And then we have the right to it. And that gets back to this, because the notion of bursting is also, when we talked about like the rage, right, bursting apart, it's also this we can't contain certain things anymore, because it's not, otherwise we will cease to exist in this moment. And the last thing I will say to this, and I really like your thoughts on all of this, and I know it's kind of a lot to process, but is that when I think about Bell Hooks' idea of the eating of the other and the cultural appropriation that occurs through media, that Hooks argues that because Black culture has been appropriated to the extent, and this gets us back to the conversation we had earlier about the white women in blackface, it becomes a point where actually Black culture dies, right? And so when we think about this transmediation and the fact of the connection between media and human rights, and the importance of promoting and speaking to and addressing our culture, because that is also something that we also have to have that indignance about, in order to ensure the continuation of our culture as well, right? And the reality of these mediums for sharing and our culture is really important. And so part of this long protracted question has to do with the connection to I know that you've been doing a lot of work also on understanding your history and culture, your personal history and culture, and sort of speaking to that. And if you can speak to that as well, and the importance of that.
For sure. So the place that I would begin is saying that too is genocide, is culturicide, and we speak of culturicide in the Black community in terms of entertainment a lot of times, right? Well, these white people playing jazz now, right? Look at what these Koreans are doing with hip hop, right? Look at, you made soul food and turned it corporate with,
Whole Foods in the
country, right?
Wait, I'm sorry. You don't know how to make collard greens at all.
Right?
Period.
These kinds of things.
My grandma.
Now, one thing I'm looking at, these are different concepts, right? So one is the neo-genocide and culturicide, which is a part of the genocide. But there's another concept that takes place with neo-genocide in a neo-genocidal context, and that is sociocultural deprivation. And what I understand, and I'm not a psychologist, but my mentors are direct lineage to Piaget, right? Yvette Jackson, and oh my gosh, I'm going to say Yvette Jackson and leave it with that Yvette Jackson right now, but, right? And then, Eric will forgive me because I forgot his last name later. Piaget, and Feuerstein took the concept of sociocultural deprivation away from its Western understanding, which was basically you didn't have access to middle class Euro-American cultural products, museums and singing and what have you, right? And he said, no, actually, sociocultural deprivation is when you don't have access to your own culture, your own cultural frames. They've been disrupted and interrupted in different ways. And there's some historic ways that that's happened with the transatlantic slave trade and, you know, policing and what have you. And then there's some immediate ways in which this happens. And for myself, it was my father's incarceration. Because in fact, I would go as far to say it was his incarceration and his escape from incarceration and then residual effects of that over years. It caused a lot of disruption in transmediation, literally, right? Jackson and Feuerstein would say mediation, but I'm saying transmediation. And I know we understand the context of that because we've been talking about it, right? But that transmediation of cultural frames that I should have gotten, not just from my father, but even both of my parents, that I didn't get due directly to incarceration, created another level of sociocultural deprivation, right? It in some ways, it's like complex trauma, like in your first podcast, I think it was. So part of what happens when people, I mean, now mind you, it's not just a deficit thing. I mean, first of all, it's a real thing. It's part of colonial oppression. But it doesn't mean we also don't have those funds of knowledge, like Moore would talk about, or we don't have, different cultural values that we've developed, like Yoso talks about, right? I mean, we do have those things. That's part of the human spirit. That's part of the divine design of the brain and the body and so forth, right? But still, that has to be reckoned with, and right. It gets reckoned with in different ways.
Yeah.
For me, it's most recently gotten reckoned with by a direct dive into ancestry, and then getting reached out to by members of my family who were like 6 degrees away, 2 degrees away, and I didn't know, and we didn't know, and so forth. And even right before we were to get on, as I was getting set up, I got contacted. I had been contacted recently by some women in Ohio who are also cousins. Wow. Third generation Fisk, right? People who I didn't know existed, teachers, right? And so they did a real quick little call with me, right? Just right before this took place. And so it was this kind of a nice affirmation. Wow. And so forth. Mm-hmm. But the point is that in doing the deep dive, part of what I've come to learn is that my family culture, and by extension, Black culture, is teacherly. We have a teacherly tradition, and that is in part realized through Black teacher lineages, right? Families that have your own family, as I sit here before you, right? You and your mom, and I bet you name a whole bunch of others real quickly.
Yeah.
So I am now uncovering the biographies. I'm down to that level now of a number of these ancestors and elders who were Black teachers. And I'm learning that my tendencies, my engagements, my understandings, my surroundedness by books was part of that family culture. And what's fascinating is that it was not just singular, it was communal. Mm-hmm. The first aunt I have out of slavery, the first generation out, right? She spent no time, her father was. among other things, she was a charter member, and this is also Black Appalachia too. So this is also another nuance of this in terms of stereotypical thinking about Blacks in general, in terms of teaching and learning and education. But additionally, when you add that it's Appalachia, Zanesville is right up near West Virginia. It's right up on the foothills of those mountains, Appalachian Mountains. So in this area, this is Mary C. Turner and then Mary C. Banks by marriage. Teacher, longtime member of AME, a charter member of the Women's Study Club, frequently written up in what they had in the Zanesville paper. They called it the Color Citizens events and news. And so she would be in there periodically, always doing civic-oriented work. The mission or the motto of the Women's Study Club was lifting as we climb. At one point in one of the old newspapers, and this is around now, I guess it was established around 1916. She was born in 1868, excuse me. They published the list of topics that they would be covering and the ones that she was hosting at her home. And it was fascinating the kinds of conversations these women were having. They were talking about, now dig this, they were talking about Mahatma Gandhi and Satyagraha, nonviolence. How many years before Martin Luther King?
Yes.
Right?
Yes.
They were talking about Frederick Douglass, who less than 50 years ago had delivered a number of speeches in that location. Now, the two sessions that she hosted was one on the plight of the American Indian. The second one was on Haiti. Wow. And at that time, and this was now in 1932, so this is how long she had been, doing this. At that time, the United States had just invaded Haiti. So these women in this little Appalachian city of Zanesville, Ohio, Black women, were getting together, they were reading, they were studying their Bible, they were reading, they were discussing global events of the day, they were talking about things right in the area.
Yeah.
Off the strength of that, these women established a cultural center for the kids and the families in the neighborhood to come, which is still standing. And then generations of Turners, participated and hung out there in various capacities. So that same sort of, I guess what Gramsci call it, organic intellectual, right? That because she only had a high school education.
Yeah.
She only had a high school education. Right?
Yeah.
So that I see that and saw that in my grandfather. The books everywhere. He only had a high school education. He wanted to be a butcher. He ended up being a custodian. He handled his business in that regard. But there were a lot of folks like that. So to pull all of the strings and narratives, all right, one of the things that I see in me is this continuity of literacy, intellectualism, and all of this for them were surrounded around Black institutions and Black institution building. They were building these institutions. Aunt Martha, who was mentored by Aunt May, that was Mary, the woman who started this literacy club, when she moved to Dayton, she went to Wilberforce, she maintained a relationship with AME, became a trustee, married a doctor, and regularly held fundraising and events and what have you, and was a teacher at Paul Lawrence Dunbar High School, lived down the street from where Paul Lawrence Dunbar's house was. This was not when he was living, right, but lived. So there's this continuity, right, that is in my family in that regard. But we know at a macro level, Black teacherly culture and Black teacher lineages were disrupted. They were disrupted. For me, it was disrupted because of my father's incarceration and whatever other issues my parents had in dealing with that.
Yes.
But there are other ways and places in which it was disrupted, right? I've learned that there are teachers on all kinds of sides of my family, right? Like, so on my mother's side, both her grandfather, or both my grandfather, and that's these Turners I'm talking about, but also on her mother's side, my grandmother, right? And they were down in Tuskegee and what have you, which I've talked a little bit about. So you think about the disruption down there. If they were in the deep South, not Appalachia, they were in the deep South. Schools were burned down there, right?
Yeah.
Some of those lynching memorials were to people who tried to teach slaves to read.
That's right.
Or who were teachers. So that's culturicide.
Yes, it is.
That's disrupting Black intellectualism.
That's 100% right.
And
and that's one of the things too, historically, the disruption on a large scale happened with the integration that happened, right?
That was another move. That was another major move.
Yes, that was a huge loss to this Black teacherly culture that you're referencing in the 1950s, right?
Yes. It took jobs away. It displaced people. It broke up networks of support that were centered around some of these teachers and ideological ideas that were. So it's part of the culture side. It's part of the culture.
So part of what we you and I are actually doing is well, we're doing a lot together, but
we are.
One thing that we're definitely doing is in honor of Black teachers and Black women teachers is that we are doing a professional learning community of teachers, right? And we are launching this. It's going to be in February. It's going to be on Wednesdays for a month. So each 4 weeks in February through the Center for Teaching and Learning at Sacramento State, and also funded through a grant that I have from the National Science Foundation, which is dedicated. It's an eager grant that is dedicated to supporting learning from Black women teachers how to support Black girls, and particularly Black girls in to increase Black people into computing and computer science. So we are going to talk a little bit more about that, but I wanted to do that shout out here because and when I do the information for this, I will also share the link for people to apply. We are definitely going to have folks that are involved in the research project to participate, and it's definitely open to graduates of the multiple self-identified Black women who graduated from the multiple subject program at Sac State, the special education program at Sac State. But in addition to that, we are opening it up to we would love, Black educators who are interested in, we're kind of working with us to develop a third space where we tap into this idea of Black teacherly culture, the historical practices of Black women educators, where we learn from them, right? How to articulate. We will both, share our own personal histories of, and then also the other person who's going to be working with us on this is Dr. Malika Hollenside, who is another professor at Sacramento State University. And we will have a sharing at the Multicultural Education Conference, which is joint. We're both co-chairing this
So that's
year, right? This is the first time in the history of the Multicultural Education Conference that is Black co-chairs, right? So that's a historical thing that we're doing. And also I want to say, so the date of that is March 20th for that conference. That conference, it will be a webinar. It is open, so anyone can participate, no matter where you are in the world. And also we will be sharing out more information about like how people can apply to actually be presenters and things of that nature. But yeah, so there's a lot going on.
It is, and you know what? I just want to reflect back on what you're saying about the faculty learning community. Part of why that's so important is that although we know this already from other research, it's important that it gets reaffirmed. But the patterns that I see is that Black people became teachers and educators in different fashions in the community, partly because of the institutions that were established and fostered to foster those other folk. And in my own case, as I mentioned, it was the AME Church in Zanesville and Dayton. It was Wilberforce University, right? It was actually, if I pushed it back, it was actually abolitionist networks, like on the Real, right? And those were organized, groups and so forth, specifically to fight anti-Black racism, right? And so, and then there was even Central State and Tuskegee, and although not me obviously, but AKA as well, right? Like in my family, traditions of teachers, like these are the organizations that I saw that I'm finding that they were linked with, and that they were linked with over generations, right? So Aunt Martha was a lifelong member of AKA, and she mentored my cousin Kay, who's now 80 some years old, right, to become AKA. And although she never explicitly told her granddaughter, my cousin Erica Malone, to become AKA when she was at Indiana University, that's what she pledged. And it's almost in the same way that me and my younger sister became teachers, even though we didn't have a conscious awareness of this family tradition. Organization still pulled us in, but it was becoming who one is. And so having this structural, organizational, like third space development.
Yes.
To say this is a contribution to organizing to support the continuity of Black teachers, Black women teachers.
And also, I want to say that part of connecting it back to our larger conversation is that we acknowledge that by not having our institutions name the neo-genocide, that our institutions contribute to the neo-genocide, right? So we, in this third space, we actually will be working to develop the language to actually be to naming this for no matter what institution that you are in. So if you are a teacher, if you're a public educator, that we need to be naming this work, right? And that, to get our institutions to be pushing back against like government's influences that are, aspiring to kill us, right? And literally murder us.
Straight up. Yeah.
So we need to be doing that, right? And so, and part of our commitment, right, that we made in our initial conversation was to save each other's lives, right? So we said, we made that commitment to each other. It was like, we know that, this society is currently trying to murder us. This is a neo-genocidal attack on our lives. And so we are going to make a commitment to say no, right, to stop this. And so, to the Fanon piece, the indignation then is like saying, like, how dare you try and kill us, right? Like, we're not going to just sit back and just let it happen, right? So this space is that space to come up with a collective language that we can use, a statement, that we can make that we will, you know, just as we do our like the land acknowledgements, we also need to be doing the neo-genocidal acknowledgement, right? We need to be doing that acknowledgement so that we are also saving the lives of our, you know, our children, our, you know, we have to survive, right? We have to survive. So I'm going to thank you so much. Thank you. Just, I mean, yeah.
Pleasure was all mine. Loved it. Loved it. Loved building with you on this. It's good fodder for the work that we're doing going forward. So thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.